All right. So, friends, we have been studying the book of Galatians, and we have made it to the third chapter now. So this means that we're getting into some real core of the argument right now. We had enough history. We had a good preamble, good introduction, so we kind of were led into this part of the letter now where Shaul starts to really come down hard on his disciples, let's put it that way. And so let's read the first three verses out of chapter 3, and then I'm going to go over some of the features that I want to explain to you. So Galatians chapter 3, verses 1 through 3. You foolish Galatians, who has bewitched you, before whose eyes Jesus Christ was publicly portrayed as crucified. This is the only thing I want to find out from you. Did you receive the Spirit by the works of the law, or by hearing with faith? Are you so foolish? Having begun by the Spirit, are you now being perfected by the flesh? So let's stop there. These are rhetorical questions, obviously, but you could see how he comes down pretty hard on them in the very first verse. After all this compliments and history retelling, he says, "You foolish Galatians." Man, the word foolish is it's a soft word for foolish. It means lacking understanding, kind of foolish in a sense of not clear in your mind, confused, if you want to say. That's the kind of word foolish. It's not like, stupid foolish or anything like that. It's, in a sense, it is similar to how we use word foolish in English, so I think it's a good translation. There's some other possibilities that are good too. But he comes down and basically tells them that you lack sense. You lack sense. You lack common sense, he says. And obviously it's clear he's talking Galatians. We talked about that's a group of believers scattered around the region of Galatia, not some one little group. It's probably a whole network of different home groups that he's talking to. And then he says, who has bewitched you? Now, different translations will say differently, but basically it has nothing to do with witchcraft or anything like that. It simply says, who has confused you? Who has affected you in such a way that you now have been influenced and you don't understand the important things that you need to understand. They are confused about their relationship with God. They're confused about Yeshua. That's what it seems. Because this who has bewitched you, and this is before whose eyes Jesus was publicly portrayed as crucified. So they saw Yeshua, but then somehow these people who came to confuse them, it brought confusion to their understanding of Yeshua that they had before. Okay? So it's a little bit hard for us to understand because, again, we're not told exactly what the issue is. Remember, the book of Galatians is Shaul's answer, but we don't know the original confusion. So it's his answer to the confusion. So we have to work backwards from the answer and maybe, hopefully, come up with some understanding of what that confusion might have been and why it came to be. So right here, Shaul says that Messiah was portrayed as crucified. Were portrayed as crucified right before their eyes. Now, what does that mean? Well, it seems that Galatians just had come to visualize what happened to Yeshua. Think of it as if they had like a movie playing in their minds. As Shaul witnessed to them, what has happened to them is they have actually put themselves into the story to the point where this became so real to them, as if it actually happened and as if they actually saw it with their own eyes. This is what he's saying. He says, basically, that Yeshua was as if he was crucified in front of you, as if you saw him. And how can you be confused when you had such a clear vision and such a clear understanding of this truth? How can you be now confused? Because it was so clear in your mind. Why can't you, continue on? In a sense, that's what he's saying. How can you be swayed now? We're not sure what's happening here exactly, but we can kind of get the sense out of the information that we're given in the verse. And then look at verse 2. He begins his first argument here. He argues from personal experience, he argues from history, argues from what has happened to them. See, there's a transformation that happened in the lives of Galatians. And that's undeniable. After they heard that message of Yeshua, after they've seen him portrayed as if he was dying right in front of them, there's something that has happened with them. There's a transformation. And so he says to them this question, it comes from testimony. He says, it's a simple question. Did you receive the Spirit? What does it mean? Meaning God's presence in their lives, through the works of the law. That's what he says. And the works of the law, here's that term again. We talked about it earlier in our previous session, what that means, the two possible meanings of the works of the law. Right? So either one of these meanings that you attach to this verse, it makes sense. At this point, it's not a problem at all. So whatever that means, did you receive the Spirit by keeping the Sabbath or getting circumcised or putting on a mezuzah, on your door? Did you receive the Spirit through mechanical obedience to Torah, is what he's saying. Either one of these meanings works. And of course it's a rhetorical question because everybody knows the answer is no. Why? Because when Galatians received the Spirit, meaning when they encountered God for real in their life, they were as far away from Torah as anybody in this world. They didn't know anything. Shaul came to them. He told them the good news of Yeshua. They believed. They accepted it. They had this vision of him actually dying right there. And they've accepted his good news. They have accepted the implications of it. And the transformation happened in their hearts. And so he's saying, look, you want to follow Torah. You're so concerned with getting circumcised and doing all these things. Did you get the Spirit because you were such a good follower of the Torah? You were so, accurate in observing everything. You did this and this and that, and is that how you get the Spirit? So it's a rhetorical question, and obviously, it's not the way it happened. It says, so did you receive the Spirit through the works of law or hearing with faith? Hearing with faith. Now, remember, faith is a little bit more complicated in the Eastern context than it is in a Western context. Did you receive the Spirit by hearing the report, right, that I brought? Did you receive the Spirit by hearing the witness? Did you receive the Spirit with belief, with reliance, with trust in God? Is that how you receive the Spirit, or did you receive it the other way? That's what he's trying to say. And of course, the answer is the latter. No, they received it because they heard the witness, they accepted the words, they believed, they trusted that it was true, and that's when the Spirit came upon them. That's when something changed in their life. So at this point, they didn't really know Torah. So in verse 3, he's again calling them foolish. Are you so foolish? Having begun by the Spirit, while you're being perfected by the flesh. Now, it presents a hypothetical scenario here for you. Which obviously is not true. He says you begin by the Spirit, so you have God's Spirit come into you, make this transformation, and now you think the flesh is going to come and help you to become perfect, help you become better. Honestly, this is a thinking of many people. It's a very typical, very common thinking. I meet it today all the time. Remember, God helped you. God came in, He did all this transformation, and now you think that you're going to match what He did, His work, by your own self-effort, by your own kind of trying to improve yourself.
Kind of like when he was talking about you can't make yourself righteous. Righteousness has to come through.
Right. Outside source righteousness versus righteousness that proceeds from ourselves, from our own trying and working really, really hard. And we'll talk a little bit about righteousness today, a little later. So the reason why people tend to lean this way, the reason why people like this teaching a lot, the reason why people like this logic a lot, is because it gives us a role to play. It gives us a little bit of a control in a relationship. Because otherwise we feel like we're not involved, like it's all God and no us. And so unfortunately, many of us are control freaks. We have this desire to be involved in a relationship that God has with us in this way. And so it gives us a role. The sentence seems very straightforward here, but not really 100%. The reason is because how people understand Shaul's terminology determines the meaning of what they will take away from the sentence. So the impact of the sentences is not just the words, but how we understand them, how we interpret what he says. What does he mean by these words? And so, what if I told you that Shaul has a very particular sense in which he uses certain words, and sometimes it does not match our typical modern day thinking? Because we're used to use this word in the way we are used to using it, but he is not using it in the way we do, because he doesn't live in the same time, in the same culture, in the same place, and he's writing a very occasional letter, a very important letter, that where he tries to get certain points across. And these are the words he chooses, but you and I, again, looking from our perspective, we may see those words in an entirely different light. So I have to connect some dots for you, and I cannot neglect the terminology that just came up here. And the terminology that I'm speaking specifically is the word spirit and the word flesh. How does Shaul use spirit? How does he use word flesh? Now, he does this throughout the entire book of Galatians. It's consistency. If you understand how he uses spirit and how he uses flesh, it will open up all the rest of the verses to you, because he will keep using them in the same exact way. Usually by the Spirit, Shaul means, obviously, God. It means his presence, his salvation experience, right? Something that rejuvenates us, something that changes us. This is God's presence in our life. That's one of the rudimentary, basic meanings of the Spirit. He also means a divine, supernatural aspect of life. Whenever you think Spirit, think supernatural. Think unusual. Okay? By Spirit, he means fullness of life that God has to offer. That's what he means by Spirit. He means the fulfillment of God's promises, and God promised to be with us. So having Spirit, achieving the Spirit, having Spirit come upon you or being poured out upon you, that's what really he's talking about. It's a fulfillment of promises. For him, it's a fulfillment issue. And so connect the Spirit to the fulfillment of the promises of Abraham. It's the end result. It's the very, very end result that we're striving after, is to have God's Spirit. Because if we have God's Spirit, we have received the fullness of the promises that we're all given. We have received that spiritual blessing that the covenant really promises. Because if we have the Spirit, we have God, we have His presence, we have everything we need. That is the fullness, it's the end result. So it's the promise fulfilled for Israel and for the nations, and that's the desired end result. Now, flesh. What does he mean by flesh? It's not something for Shaul. We're used to think of something like flesh as being something carnal, sometimes maybe not good, but for him it's not always necessarily evil or anything like that. He refers by flesh to the natural versus the non-natural, the supernatural. So if spirit is supernatural, something that comes from God, and something is really from His domain, then flesh is something that we're very familiar with, that's actually very natural. It's something that we are born with, it's something that we know, it's something that we can feel, touch. It's the most comfortable part for us. So flesh is not necessarily bad, because flesh is not evil. Dualists in the ancient world believed that flesh was bad and spirit was good. Some Greeks believed that. Zoroastrians believed that. A lot of people who practice dualistic beliefs, that's what they thought. And frankly, a lot of times when people interpret Bible, that's how they think. Spirit good, flesh bad. You know? Torah good, no, Torah bad, and then grace good, right? That's what people say. What? Because grace is spiritual and Torah is fleshly, because it gives you all kinds of fleshly commandments to fulfill. That's how people interpret the Bible. But that dualistic thinking is a trap, because Jewish mind never thought that way. Jews never thought of their bodies as evil or of their bodily functions as sinful to themselves. This is why people who are into dualistic thinking, that's why monastic movement came to be, for example. Self-mortification, making your body suffer, depriving yourself of things, to submit your flesh to your spirit. So the spirit will rise to the top and the flesh will be subdued. I mean, that's how people looked at it. They looked at their body as evil. They wouldn't procreate. Why? Because they thought it was evil. The very function of procreation was considered to be dirty. There's nothing dirty about it. God created it. In fact, He commanded it. I mean, it's the first commandment in the Bible, in Genesis. The very first commandment is to be fruitful and multiply. Well, we know how we humans are fruitful and multiply. There's only one way to do it. So why would God command anything dirty? It's a really backwards logic. But again, if you think that everything fleshly is evil and bad and that's holding you back, and everything spiritual is good, then of course the desire is to rid yourself of flesh and to let the Spirit come out. But that's just simply not true. Jews never thought that way. It's not part of Hebrew mind thinking. So flesh is inferior, however, to the supernatural ways of God. See, it's not evil, but it is simply inferior. Why? Because it does limit us. Supernatural is not limited. Spirit is not limited in anything. Flesh, by definition, has limitations. So, inferior to the greater reality of God. Think spiritual. Spirit is the greater reality of God. Flesh is still a reality of God. Flesh can be holy, it can be sanctified by God, it can be good. In fact, it has been throughout the entire Bible, but it's still not the same as spirit. Spirit is a greater reality. Why? Because it comes directly from God. And so only in connection to the Spirit, the flesh finds its right place. You see, if flesh and spirit are connected, if there's a right balance between these things, then there's that right place, then there's that proper position. In itself, if it's just flesh and no spirit, then it does not represent the fullness of reality. See, so being fleshly only, right, you're devoid of God, right? So if it's only flesh, if everything is only biological, if everything is only physiological, if you explain everything that happens in your life in only naturalistic, biological, medical terms, then guess what? You've just taken God out of it. You've taken the Spirit out of it. If you say a human being is simply an organism, forget about the soul and the spirit that doesn't exist, that doesn't matter. There's no soul, spirit. We're just animals. We're organisms. We're no different from, one cell organism that just got developed into more complicated life forms. And that's what we are. We're really super complicated life forms, but really not that different from a non-complicated life forms. And you see, and that's where we really become demeaned. So there's a balance, that has to happen. And this is how Shaul uses the flesh and the spirit. So think of a spirit as the realm of supernatural, the promise that God gave, the fulfillment, the end result, the spiritual maturity that comes with that. And think of a flesh as that essential, basic, natural beginning that we all have. And that's something that makes us human beings. Whenever there's a combination of the spiritual part and the physical part together, that's what makes us a whole, complete human being. We cannot be complete without all the components that we have. That's what makes us human. So, there's a balance. And so if you interpret these words that way, hopefully it will make a little bit more sense. What he's saying is basically, you began in the Spirit, now you want to continue in flesh. You began with God supernaturally. You began in the miraculous way, and now you're choosing a fleshly way, meaning non-miraculous, non-supernatural. Now you want to do it the natural way which you know how to do all things. Just like you figured out how to organize your life and live your life and do these things, which is basic, life experience, human. It doesn't require miracles. Now you want to continue your spiritual growth the same way. And so this is what he's saying. You began supernatural and now you want to perfect yourself, in a natural way. Why not stay there? All right. So that was verse 3. Now, if you insert these meanings into these verses, they will make sense. Now, they will probably make a slightly different sense from what you may have had before. But that's what we're here to kind of expand that understanding. So apply the terminology. Now, verse 4, and I'm going to have to devote a little bit of attention to verse 4 by itself. Did you suffer so many things in vain? If indeed, was it in vain? Yes, a question, another rhetorical question, but it's also a very real question about suffering. Did you suffer things for nothing? What did Galatians suffer? What was their suffering all about, is the question. How does suffering relate to their belief? And how does it relate to their belief and their interaction with the Spirit? Because, again, all these verses is about the Spirit, right? And God and His presence. So we have no choice but to read here between the lines, because we don't have any more information about their suffering in this book, flat out in plain text. We have to sit down and, try to imagine what their suffering was, what was it about, what was the point, how and why it occurred. I believe it's possible to answer these questions, but it does take a little bit of work. You do have to understand the environment in which Galatians lived, and you have to understand the culture and the lives in a social setting, and maybe then we can come up with some ideas of what this suffering might have been. So I have an idea. I mean, there's several possibilities, but I'm going to present to you the most reasonable possibility that I think, just for the sake of time. And this is what they suffered that connects really to their faith. Remember that Galatians lived in a Roman society. Remember that the people who populated this area were the ancient Celts or other tribes. They mingled their worship with the Roman worship. The state cult, they worshipped numerous deities, and they even worshipped the emperor. So that was their daily lives. All the city, all the civic functions, festival events, all the social events were accompanied by sacrifices to gods and goddesses, and obviously the offerings on behalf of Rome. That's how state, continued to superimpose its importance on people and in their lives. So this was normal. Everybody was expected to participate. Everybody was expected to be a part of this ritualistic community life, if you want to say it this way. Now, having become believers, these practices were no longer possible for Galatians. Think about it for a second. And whenever a person chooses to go against the system, whenever a person chooses to go against something that exists in society and everybody's doing it, he becomes an outsider, he becomes a rebel, he becomes a misfit, right? And no one understands, not your friends, not your neighbors, not your coworkers. They all of a sudden, there's a change that occurred in you, and you no longer do that which you just did recently. There's a change to happen in you, and you no longer want to participate in the things in which a couple of weeks ago you participated just fine. So what happened? They don't understand. Why? Because they didn't have that transformation happen, and simply they cannot comprehend what has happened. Remember, pagan environment. America is a free country, and people can do all kinds of things in here, and luckily people just say, okay, it's your business, you can do whatever you want. But Asia Minor was not like that. They were not pluralistic as we are today in America. So if a person became a rebel, an outsider, and a misfit, that was a problem. So imagine what would happen to some citizens who refused to bring sacrifices on behalf of Caesar. Imagine what would happen. Well, they will become the enemies of the state. And yes, they will have persecution. Because now they're going against the entire society. And again, the people don't understand what has happened to them. So imagine the Galatians who are in this tough spot. Now, Jews throughout the Roman Empire were exempt from participating in Roman worship. I don't know if I said this or not before, but they were officially recognized as a unique ancient culture, as a people group, and were allowed to maintain their distinct ways. Romans had no problem with that. Galatians, however, accepted Jewish God, accepted Jewish beliefs, accepted Jewish ethics, but they were not identified as Jewish. So they don't have the exemption. Now, circumcision would simply make them legally Jewish right there. And they would be granted an exemption if they just circumcised, because then obviously they joined another group, another religion, and that's fine. So one can see how this offer would be very enticing, which is the whole letter of Galatians about the problem of getting circumcised, becoming a full proselyte. Shaul tells them, don't do it. So not to choose this means to choose persecution. To choose to remain in this in-between status, not really a Jew and no longer a pagan. There is nothing else that exists at this point. There's no middle category that exists in our world. And they are creating this middle category. And it's very uncomfortable for them. That choosing this way means choosing persecution. That means being misunderstood. That means really being the outsider and the rebel and a misfit in a society. So that means they're going to have persecution, they're going to have ridicule, and maybe, things are going to turn out to be terrible to them. So you can understand why the offer of circumcision is all of a sudden enticing. And it looks like this is what they've chosen so far, because Shaul says, did you suffer these things in vain? What things did they suffer? That means up until this point, they chose to be in this category. Rather be persecuted than go the easy route of circumcision. They chose to be in this middle category, this God-fearer category, what we call. Okay? And that was most likely what suffering that Shaul talks about in verse 4. And if they get circumcised, now all the previous suffering is in vain. That's what he means. Did you suffer this in vain? Because if you go through the circumcision now, then everything that you have suffered up until this point is meaningless. It's pointless. You should have done that a long time ago. You see, this is his rhetorical question. Look at what has happened to you. Look at the things you've gone through. Did you go through these for nothing? That's what he's saying. So they've had some significant troubles and sufferings in their life that we're not told about. We have to kind of figure them out. And that's what he's saying. So Shaul is trying to encourage them, and he's trying to point out but that basically by not converting fully, they're doing something, they're pointing out to something that God is doing among the Gentiles. Remember the Abrahamic covenant. The unfolding of the Abrahamic covenant is happening. If they become proselytes, that prophetic witness that God is doing something among Gentiles is lost. See, it's lost to the world. It's lost to the Jews, it's lost to Gentiles. If they just simply convert and become Jews, then there is no evidence of Abrahamic covenant coming in its fullness all of a sudden. So you see why Shaul is fighting for this so much. So that's verse 4. Hopefully it's not too contrived for you, and you can see the point that I'm making about their suffering. I thought about different kinds of things that might have happened to them, and this one seemed to be most logical of how to interpret verse 4. Let's read 5 through 9. So then, does he who provides you with the Spirit and works miracles among you do it by the works of the law or by hearing with faith? Even so Abraham believed God, and it was reckoned to him as righteousness. Therefore, be sure that it is those who are of faith who are sons of Abraham. The scripture, foreseeing that God would justify the Gentiles by faith, preached the gospel beforehand to Abraham, saying, all the nations will be blessed in you. So then, those who are of faith are blessed with Abraham, the believer. So here we are, in this passage here, Abraham comes up again. And the argument that Shaul began, he actually continues right here. Apparently, God has worked miracles in the lives of Galatians. Not only they've gone through persecution and suffering of some sort, but they also have been recipients of miracles. And logically, he did this before they knew anything about Torah, before they made any decisions or commitments to get circumcised, or before they got to the works of the law part, basically. The miracles were already happening in their life. And the very presence of the Spirit is what Shaul is trying to show to them. So, whatever the works of the law means here in this verse, again, whether these are external signs of Jewish identity or faithless mechanical adherence to Torah, either one of these meanings works again. And Torah observance or knowledge obviously was not a prerequisite for God doing mighty works in their midst. So why would they see their status as something less now? This is what he's arguing. This is the gist of his argument by asking these hypothetical questions, and particularly in verse 5. So God, did this by the Spirit. He did miracles among you. Outside of this, why do you think that now you need this? He was fully working. He was fully engaged with you. You were acceptable to him. Why do you think now you need this? So he continues on with the example of Abraham in verse 6 through 9. Shaul makes a connection between Galatians and Abraham. Now, why is that important? Because those who become circumcised, actually proselytes, in Jewish tradition become to be called B'nai Abraham, sons of Abraham. See, in traditional Judaism, if a person is a convert and he becomes circumcised, he's called the son of Abraham. That's very normal. And presumably the people who came to teach them about circumcision, that was probably the appeal of Scripture that they had. They probably took them to Genesis and looked at Abraham and started teaching from the Torah in those places, and it made sense to Galatians because it's very similar to what Shaul has told before, right? But except now they're pressing and said, well, look, Abraham got circumcised, you should get circumcised too. You want to be sons of Abraham, well, you need to follow him all the way. You know, this is what it means to be sons of Abraham. So Shaul is using the terminology of sons of Abraham here on purpose in these verses. Why? Because it's a typical legal terminology for the proselytes that would have been used in Judaism. And so Shaul tells them that Abraham himself believed, and by his act of trust in God, he was proclaimed righteous. So he's citing the Torah right there. Of course, righteous, we spoke about this before. Righteous means, to be righteous means to be forgiven, to be made right. So not that he was perfect, but that he was made right with God. And all that happened by faith, by believing in God and what God has told him. So those who believe like Abraham, Shaul says, believed, those are the sons of Abraham. To be a son of Abraham means to possess the same quality as Abraham had. And main quality that he's trying to highlight here is his faith and faithfulness and obedience. If we think about Abraham, these are the most important things that come up in our mind. These are the faithfulness and obedience. In Jewish tradition, you always think about the Akedah and putting your son up on the altar to sacrifice or something like that. That is the epitome of obedience that anybody could do. So Abraham is always thought of that way. So what he does is he parallels the idea of conversion here. There's another way to be a son of Abraham, he says. Through the same means that Abraham became righteous. Abraham became righteous by faith. You can be the son of Abraham by faith, through your belief, through your acceptance of these things. And then notice that in verse 9, this is another prophetic moment. Okay, he says that it was foreseen that God would make Gentiles righteous by faith. Did you see that? Scriptures here are personified. The scripture, the graphe, he says in this verse 9. All of a sudden, the scripture is personified. The Torah, scripture here means Torah, as if it's something alive, because the scripture does the preaching, the good news. The scripture, the Torah, preaches the good news to Abraham. He proclaims this good news, predicting that all the nations will be blessed through him. So the Torah is personified, and it's testifying to Abraham that all the nations will be blessed through you. And so Galatians, if they remain Gentiles, are the fulfillment of this promise then, according to Shaul. They're joined to Abraham by the virtue of the same faith. The believers from among the nations are with Abraham, the believer, by the virtue of their belief and not by the virtue of circumcision. So you could see the spirit part and the flesh part. It says you began with spirit, you had a supernatural experience with God, continue in the same supernatural experience, because your supernatural experience is the essence. The flesh is external. It is a witness also, it is a testament, but it is an external testament. If you have the internal evidence of God transforming your life, why do you seek an external sign or an evidence? So think of the words of the spirit and flesh here. Think of Abraham and the promise of what happened in the life of Abraham and how he got circumcised, but also remember when he got circumcised. He's going to talk about that later. The timing is important. So this is how Shaul frames this new identity of Galatian believers. For him, circumcision and conversion would work in the opposite direction from what is actually supposed to be happening. Those who believe, as Abraham did, become his sons and are blessed with him. Why? Because if you're with Abraham, if you're attached to Abraham by the virtue of faith, then you receive the blessing that Abraham has. You become part of the family. If the father of the family gets blessed, you benefit from it as well. So, plus the blessing was promised to him to begin with. So, sons, by the way, right here, does not always mean physical offspring. It can mean spiritual sons, it can mean followers as well. A lot of times in the ancient world, people would take an apprentice, and they will call that apprentice a son. Doesn't mean that they got adopted or anything like that. It's just the normal ancient language. A son is somebody who has a relationship to the person. Think of it as categories, not really words the way we use them. A category of a son, a category of a father. You can be a father figure to somebody without being their actual father, right? So guess what? Somebody can be a son figure to you without actually being a son. So think of these as categories, and that's how Hebrew thinks about it a lot of times. Hebrew talks about a daughter of a voice, bat kol. You ever heard that expression? The Talmudic and Mishnaic expression talks about a still small voice. Bat kol, the daughter of a voice. So that means a really small voice. Think daughter, a girl. So it uses a feminine. So when God speaks, sometimes his voice is still and small, and so the rabbis called it a daughter of a voice. And so they say the prophecy would be like the son of the voice would come loud and clear, but the daughter of a voice is kind of like a whisper, right? So again, these are all categories that come from ancient world, and sometimes they don't cross with the same emphasis into our modern culture because we live in a different place. So that's up to verse 9. So let's read 10 through 12 now. For as many as are of the works of the law are under a curse. For it is written, cursed is everyone who does not abide by all things written in the book of the law, to perform them. Now that no one is justified by the law before God is evident, for the righteous man shall live by faith. However, the law is not of faith. On the contrary, he who practices them shall live by them. So another passage that can be very easily confused. Quite ominous words here. If one does not understand Shaul's terminology and how he uses it, it's so easy to get confused. Now, if we apply the traditional understanding of the works of the law, it would mean what? Torah's commandments. So that means anybody who does the commandments is cursed, right? That's how most people interpret this verse. Very simple, very straightforward thinking. But remember, the secret is in understanding how Shaul uses this terminology, not how we use this terminology, not how theologians in the Middle Ages have tried to explain these verses, but how did he mean this? And so we have to search this term throughout his entire writings and see how he uses it, in which sense. And so if it's just Torah, and its commandments, then people who do them are cursed. And now that would make Torah in itself a curse, which some people actually believe. However, one remembers that Shaul's view of the Torah is always a positive one. It makes no sense. It makes no sense because at some points he affirms Torah, and at some points it appears that he doesn't. So, which is it? It becomes very consistent. Now, there are very clear, very straightforward passages throughout Shaul's writings where he affirms Torah. We don't have to wonder about them. But then there's passages like this where, what in the world is he talking about? Now, keep in mind the possible meanings of the works of the law, and one can see that the verse in an entirely different light. If you put those meanings of what the works of the law means, right, meaning the signs of Jewish identity, or the faithless observance that is improper with the wrong intent, that then all of a sudden this verse starts working in a different way. All of a sudden. So what we have here also is under a curse. That's a phrase that I have to unpack a little bit more. Just as in other places, what we have is similarly phrases like under law, or as compared to as under grace. He uses these terms throughout the entire letter. Under curse, under law, under grace. What does he mean? Well, under curse, it means to be under the power or under the influence, under the judging condemnation of the curse. Under meaning being under the authority, under the influence, if you want to call it that way. So, and then fill in the gap with whatever it is that the other word is. But in this particular situation, it says, for as many as the works of the law, meaning as many as there are of these kinds of actions or commandments, they are under curse. They are under the influence, under the power of a curse. What in the world is he talking about? This can get so confusing. But I know that if anybody studied Torah seriously, they know the famous passage where Moshe tells Israel that God's laws before them represent blessing or curse. It's a very famous place. Life and death. And he says, choose life. Remember that passage? This is what he's referring to. I mean, Shaul is quoting several passages from the Torah here, from the prophets, to connect, sort of say, this to Torah for us. But we can pretty much get that one from our understanding. So that's what he says: choose life, obey Torah. Now, for Israel, who's bound by the covenant as a nation, as a people, not following Torah can have repercussions. Torah contains numerous curses for those who walk away from that calling. Numerous times we have seen how Adonai punished Israel for not being obedient, so we know this is not a joke. We know this is serious. God is serious about curses. Torah contains curses. You want to read the final chapters of Deuteronomy? It's all a long list of curses. In fact, when the Torah is being read in that cycle of reading, you're not allowed to end the reading and the parsha on the curses. You must go to the next parsha and actually read a small passage that doesn't talk about the curses, because you want to end on a positive note. I mean, it's really funny, but that's what the tradition says. When you get to that point, that you can't just stop here and read only curses. You have to go on, and because why? Because God is good. He's fundamentally good, and so that would be misrepresenting his nature to stop right there. Again, it's tradition, but again, it teaches you things and it reinforces our beliefs. So what we have is life and death, blessing, curse. Torah does have curses. What Shaul says to his disciples, that being Jewish, becoming a son of the covenant, has some downsides. It has a little side effect. If one becomes responsible to keep all things, you become a convert, you become circumcised, you become responsible for all these things, meaning all commandments, all of the commandments. So when one fails in that, then the natural outcome would be curses and disobedience to Torah, because that's what God promised, right? That's the simple terms of the covenant. You do this, you get blessing. You don't do this, you get curse. So there's a downside. And so Israel's fate and history is not an easy one. We know the story, we know the history. Torah is not just a gift, it's also a responsibility. And that's what he's trying to tell his disciples. Look, it's not that all peachy. There's also serious implications that you have to consider. Because if you go this route, you'll be liable for all things, all commandments in the Torah. You're supposed to do them as they're written in the book of the law, to perform them. So you can't just pick and choose. So that's his warning. All that he says here, he says, keep in mind, in light of circumcision, in light of the conversion conversation, because that's what they're talking about. Torah has curses. Abrahamic covenant, however, does not have any curses. If you studied it lately, you would know. It has blessings, and it has no conditions at all. No conditions, no repercussions. Not like the Sinai contract at all. So notice the opposition that he makes in this passage. Blessing, curse. Spirit, flesh. Faith, works of the law. He creates these opposite terms, these sharp, contrasting terms, to really to frame his argument. Why? Because it helps people to see things clearer. And it's a very strong argument right here. We're getting to a really strong rhetorical part of the book. People have used these words and abused these words and reused these words to assault all of their opponents throughout history. Theologians have done this. They've always attached these verses to the guys who they don't like, whoever that may be, which is usually some other theological camp. They say that's about them. That's what these people are. They're foolish like Galatians, and that's what comes upon them. Very strong argument. So he goes on to say in verse 11 that no one can be made righteous by the law because no one can keep it perfectly, obviously. Besides that, the Torah was not really given as an instrument for this very purpose. Now it does take reliance on God, and takes reliance on His good character. It takes trust that God will be consistent with who He is and will pardon our disobedience in His mercy. Think about it. That's when we talk about when we say faith. Is faith in what? Faith in who? We're talking about believing that God is consistent with His attributes of mercy and goodness. So that's justification. When we say being made righteous, being justified, that's what we're talking about. God practicing His mercy and His goodness and allowing us to walk away from the punishment that we should have gotten. So that means a benevolent judge. That's what we're talking about. Now, obviously, this doesn't mean that a person gets to break all the rules, right? Because we do lack righteousness, and we are imperfect, but we have to be respectful to God and His laws, and He then, as a benevolent judge, has the right to acquit us if He wants to. He can dismiss the case. Think about it this way. If you're disrespectful to the judge, if you dishonor the laws, the judge will say that this person doesn't deserve to be acquitted. He deserves the full punishment for what he has done. And so there's leniency that exists, but that leniency is not unqualified. It's just not given to everybody automatically necessarily. So that doesn't mean that because a person can in full bag on God's mercy and righteousness, and say righteousness is mine, I don't have to do anything. I can have it anyway. It's really not that simple. I mean, you can fool people, but you really can't fool God. So that's what it comes down to. God can see in us, through us, and nobody's going to get away with fooling God, ever. If there's impurity in their heart, if there's any kind of ill will, God's going to see through it. That's what makes Him different as a judge from the human judges that we have. So this is what Shaul means that when he says that no one is justified by Torah. No one can withstand His judgment without the need of lenience. If we were to be truly judged 100% by what Torah says, nobody's going to survive. Nobody's going to survive. So we all need lenience. We all need lenience when being judged by Torah. And so no one except Yeshua actually can withstand it. He can, because He never did anything wrong. So anyone who's truly righteous, Shaul says, knows that he's justified not by the perfect adherence, but by his faith, by his faithfulness to Torah, by his belief and trust that this is who God is and that's what He does, that He makes people righteous. Remember that in Greek, faith, pistis, means faithfulness, belief, and trust. It's much more than just in English. English may just mean mental belief or inner belief. But in Greek and Hebrew, if you're going to go into those languages and you look up the word faith and look at all the meanings that it has, it is much deeper. So for Easterner, it's not the exercise of intellect when we say faith. When people say, do you believe? Oh, of course I believe. I see it. Of course I believe it. Well, that's not the kind of belief we're talking about. We're talking about trust. We're talking about reliance. We're talking about faithfulness. Sticking to that which you know is true, and not wavering. So when we come up with these words, faith, keep in mind those meanings, and that will help you understand what Shaul is trying to get to. So the verse right here that we read about curses is very powerful. It's a strong statement. Shaul wants to make sure that he's understood very properly, so he explains his teaching further in verse 12. So verses 11 and 12 are the same seamless thought pattern. And, people would have some trouble with verse 12 because of one simple fact. And that, again, brings us back to Greek. Greek has a very short word in this sentence. The word is de. It's a conjunction. It can mean but, as in showing opposition. But is a conjunction, negative conjunction. Or it can mean and, expressing addition or continuation. So imagine a conjunction that can mean but or and. It gets a little tricky now. Which is it? Well, the context is going to help you which one it is. And depending how you choose to assign a negative connotation to this conjunction or a positive connotation, the verse will flow. And the conjunction is between these verses, really. See, now my translation that I read to you, NASB, says, however. That's how verse 12 begins. Verse 11 ends and verse 12 begins. So whatever verse 12 begins in your translation, it can be another conjunction. So it can mean and, it can mean but. So it can mean opposition or contrast, or it can be a continuation of the sentence, simply affirmation of something. And so that's a difficulty. I believe it's not a negative meaning. I believe it's simply a continuation, not a but, not a however, but really a simple and. So the sentence now will read a little bit differently. Another difficulty that is hard for people to comprehend is the understanding of how Shaul uses the word namas, which is law, Torah. That's what we're talking about. I already mentioned that he uses the word in various ways, and that Greek is limited and it has only one word. Hebrew has a whole bunch of words to express the idea of Torah. Greek only has one word, which literally means law, in something more in a legal sense. Law is very limiting. If you just think that that simply means law and that's all it is, you're going to misunderstand a lot of New Testament passages particularly. There's many uses and many senses in which he uses the word namas.
Thank you.
So in verses 11 and 12, this is how he used the word law. He uses it as a legal Jewish status. The problem is the verse 12 of how he uses the word law can be misunderstood, and you can only understand it if you read 11 and 12 together, because they are in continuation of thought. So keeping in mind what I just said about the conjunction, and keeping in mind what I just said about the idea of faith, and keeping in mind what I just said about the sense in which he uses the word law, let's read this sentence this way. It says, the righteous man will live by faith. Jewish halachic status, meaning the law, does not require faith. Right? Jewish identity is automatic and is passed down to children from parents to boys with circumcision. So the legal Jewish status is not of faith, but the one who practices them meaning the commandments, meaning that same righteous man who practices the commandments, he will live by them. So read the sentence again this way. The righteous man will live by faith. Jewish halakhic status, meaning the law, is not of faith, but the one who practices them, the commandments, will live by them. And what I did is I took away the but or the however or anything. All of a sudden the sentence flow, the thoughts are not opposing, it's a continuation of the same thought. I just used it in the sense of and. So commandments are given for good life, right? They regulate our relationship with God and with others. A person who fulfills them is righteous and will have a good life. Just keep following that logic. That has nothing to do with legal Jewish status, which how he uses the word law here. And that is why law is not of faith. That's what he means is, it doesn't take faith to have a legal Jewish status of standing. It doesn't require that. That's just something that comes to you automatically.
Mm-hmm.
Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
If you read it this way, the sentence starts to make sense. You have to look a little deeper beyond English and keep in mind the meanings of the words that Shaul utilizes, and not the theologians of the past, as I said. Otherwise, if we don't read it in the way that I proposed it to you, what we come out is we have Shaul who speaks disparagingly of Torah in one sentence, and then positively about Torah in another sentence. And this would be, obviously, a negative statement about Torah, because if Torah has nothing to do with faith, then, excuse me, what about Abraham? What about Moses? What about all these things? We have all these people walking by faith in Torah. If Torah has nothing to do with faith, how does that make sense? Well, that negates the very idea of Torah. Why do we need it then? What's the point? So it's a very disparaging statement about Torah if we interpret it in a traditional way. If we understand the word law, meaning Jewish legal status, halakhic status of Jewishness, if you want to think of it this way. He says that's not a faith. That doesn't require faith. But the righteous man lives by faith, whoever that righteous man will be. Okay, well, we can come back to it and discuss it a little bit more if clarification is needed. I want to press on to the end. We have verses 13 and 14. We get to the conclusion of Shaul's primary thought. He talks more about the curse. So verse 13 and 14. Christ redeemed us from the curse of the law, having become a curse for us. For it is written, cursed is everyone who hangs on a tree. In order that in Christ Jesus the blessing of Abraham might come to the Gentiles, so that we would receive the promise of the Spirit through faith. I'm going to stop right there. So this is his conclusion to his primary thought that he's been unfolding in this entire passage. Talks about the curse. Again, for some people, Torah is the curse. That's how they see it. But we know Jews did not think that way. Our God is a good father who does not give his children a curse and then calls it a gift. So Torah contains curses, but there's also consequences for disobedience. That they are deterrents. That's what it's about. So from that, Yeshua has redeemed us from the curses that are contained in the Torah. This is what Shaul says. He took the curse upon himself as a perfect Israelite. Remember, Yeshua is an Israelite. Mm-hmm. As a perfect Israelite, he is the Israelite. There's no better Israelite than him. As the high priest, as the Messiah, as a sacrifice, he has a right to take the curses upon himself. That is a function and a feature of a redemptive system that God has given in the Torah.
Didn't Aaron do that too?
He can do that too.
Didn't he have to take all the sin for his people?
Priest can step in. To answer your question, in Jewish literature, the priest can step in and take on the sins of the people upon himself as a mediator. If you remember, Moses did something very similar. When God was about to destroy people, Moses steps in and says, if you're going to destroy them, then take me out of the book of life. Right? What is he doing? He's stepping up as he's saying, right, as a scapegoat. That's what he's doing. He's saying, if you're going to destroy them, destroy me. I am willing to stand for these people. So whatever you have to supplant, their wickedness, my righteousness, let's equal it out. There's good and there's bad. God look at all the good that over here. So that's what happens. So when Yeshua dies, he takes a curse upon himself. He does the high priestly function. He does the sacrificial function. He can do that. That's what occurs. And that's what he delivers us from the very curses that occur in Torah. But you see, the thought does not end there. In verse 14, the thought continues. He says he did this in order that in him, in Messiah, the blessing of Abraham could come to the Gentiles.
Yeah.
You hear that? This is very important. For Shaul, the purpose of Yeshua's death was to usher the fulfillment of Abraham's promise. And in you, all the families of earth will be blessed. That's why Yeshua is dying, so that can happen. Because without that, without taking away the curses, that can't happen. The Abrahamic covenant cannot be fulfilled. There has to be a new era, a new beginning, and Yeshua ushers that in through what he does. Wow. So this is a big one. The Gentiles are very important in this particular framework, in this kind of theology. This is very important. Gentiles all of a sudden become crucial part of the fulfillment for Shaul, and making them halachically Jewish, meaning circumcising them, would be undoing what Yeshua did. But that's not all yet. It keeps going. Look at continuation. The blessings of Abraham comes to Gentiles so that we, whoever we are, here would have the Spirit. Did you see that end right there? Mm-hmm. Now I would guess that we does not mean Gentiles, because grammatically, if one talks about Gentile, they should say they, right? As far as first person, third person, the rules have to follow. So whoever we is, I would guess that we must mean Jews. Perhaps Shaul and others who write the letter with him. Remember, when he begins in the very first chapter, he says, we write to you this letter. Me and the guys who are with me. Right? So he had some co-workers. So he addresses the letter from himself and the people who are with me. So there are some co-workers, some travelers, some people who are aiding him in his work. And so, to me, this is the same use of we right here. That's what he means when he says we. The fulfillment of Abraham's covenant happens, and the Jews would receive the promise of the Spirit through faith. And that's why he fights for them so hard, because his theology is this way. And then he understands that the promise of the Spirit, which is the final ending point for Israel as well, that's the maturity, really, comes only when all things fulfilled. And Gentiles are a key in the fulfillment scheme of things. So the promise of the Spirit is an eschatological term. Think of it this way. In the end of the days, the Spirit is supposed to be poured out upon all Israel. That's what we read the prophets say. Shaul sees the world as a typical Jew would see this world, in an eschatological, in a very apocalyptic terms. It's all happening. The prophets have been fulfilled all right there in front of him right now. And so the only way to receive the Spirit, of course, is by faith. And don't forget that Shaul is not talking about the Spirit as Pentecostals do. He is talking as a Jew does. To him, the Spirit means fullness, fulfillment, maturity. It means fullness of supernatural reality of God that manifests itself in this world. That's what he's talking about. Nothing short of a kingdom of God becoming real in our midst. That's what we're talking about, the presence of God's Spirit. These are the eschatological end-time terms that Shaul uses. That's what he means, the Spirit within us. It's the manifestation of God's presence in a very powerful way. So Gentiles are important to Shaul's theology, and that is why he's discouraged them from becoming Jews, from getting circumcised. Now you're kind of getting the front part of his argument. Now it's going to keep going, and it's going to get a little uglier and a little bit more complicated, but if you stay with me, as I try to explain this terminology, by the end of this letter, by reading further, I would have explained all the terms that you need to understand, and all of a sudden the reading of Galatians will become simpler, and you will not be sitting and saying, wait a minute, how does this work now? It will become almost innate nature once you start reading it this way for a little while. So when we get through these core middle chapters, the rest will be much smoother sailing. It's just I have to explain so much because these are complicated chapters, and it can be so easily misunderstood.